more powerful. And as they get more powerful, people do things, right? And I think if you roll the clock back to Ronald Reagan, he would say, government's the problem, government's not the solution. So let's take nuclear energy, right? The cleanest form of energy is nuclear energy. It's the cleanest, probably the safest. Nobody died at 3 Mile Island. We can't hardly trace a death from nuclear energy in the U.S. And yet we haven't built a nuclear power plant since the creation of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission 50 years ago. And in Germany, they shut all theirs down. Right. And in Japan, they shut all theirs down. Something great is accomplished without a decade. If you look at Microsoft, the company's founded in the mid-70s, a decade later in their mid-80s. If you're not willing to hold Microsoft stock for a decade, you probably didn't get to the point where they came public. So a decade's a short period of time for someone who's an industrialist or an investor. I mean, Warren Buffett still owns Coca-Cola stock, and he must have bought it 50 years ago, right? So I think that anybody that's a billionaire, right? All of these names, the Sergey Brins, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musks of the world, they didn't get there without holding an asset that had technical potential for a decade or longer. There's no get rich quick scheme. So I think that people want an easy route. If you're trying to get a quick win with no volatility, with no risk, doesn't make sense. And if you're actually trying to be successful in a hurry with volatility, that probably still won't work either. I mean, ultimately, success comes from taking a decade-long view, right? Andrew Mellon, John D. Rockefeller, Jeff B. each other. Yeah. We arrested a dude on a surfboard in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for basically paddle boarding in the middle of the Pacific because that was deemed as unsafe, right? That kind of stuff. So we have an unprecedented amount of encroachment. We have politicians overriding the free market. They tell you what kind of energy you can use. They tell you, how far you have to sit from someone. They tell you whether it's safe to be sitting in your office at a table next to someone. Lots and lots of encroachment. Each of these areas, right? War is the suppression of the free market to the benefit of the public or the public organization, right? The government is suppressing the free market. So if the government keeps suppressing the free market everywhere, what you do is you cripple production, right? Yeah, that's what we have tariffs on Chinese imports, right? That drive up prices up or down, drives them up, right? You have a war or a labor war, right? If everybody unionizes and if everybody, by the way, is misunderstood, the currency weakened by 20% in the year after COVID. If the economy measured in nominal terms is flat, that meant that the overall economic output decreased by 20%. The overall economic output decreased by 20% or more in the last 2 years. People wonder if we're in a recession. We've been in recession since March of 2020. But what we have is a situation where all the metrics are distorted, right? For example, how many people would measure the economy based upon GDP output measured in dollars? Most. Is that the correct measure? No, right? Because the dollar is not worth what it was 24 months ago, right?
What if would you look at it?
You have to measure it in real terms or measure it in the actual output of goods and services. For example, how many airline miles got flown, right? If Emirates Airlines grounded half their fleet and decommissioned it after COVID, now they're up and running the part they didn't decommission. How is it possible that the air sector could possibly recover to the point where it was in January of 2020? If you've actually mothballed or decommissioned half the airplanes, right? I could double the price of a ticket. If I double the price of a ticket, I can tell you, like, it's inflation on something you want, but I'm not going to choose to measure. For example, the 30-year bond is traded up to 350 basis points, and it was 180, right? Mortgages have doubled. So mortgages have doubled, housing prices are up 35%. And that means in theory, the cost for you to actually buy a home is going to be 50, 60% higher year over year. But I don't choose to measure it because we don't actually calculate CPI that way. I take a survey and I ask you whether or not you think you could raise your rent by something. And if the owner equivalent rent is up 3%, and I say that the inflation is 3 or 5. So we have a set of metrics that are just manufactured metrics. And then we focus on them and then we talk about them. But ultimately, what you have is an economy that's distorted. There are some things we produce more of, and there are some things we produce less of. And we have flexibility with what we choose to measure. The monetary intervention is the government basically. You never recover from the fact that nobody went to school for a year, and nobody went to work for a year, right? You can't. You've lost that forever. You're just not measuring it. You can change your metrics. Right, there's a saying, you write the winners write the history books. So the Romans remember the Carthaginians as being like evil, right? If we win the war, then we write out all of the good that our adversary did, and we write up all the good that we did, and we suppress all the bad that we did because we won the war. We write the history books. And so I think right now what you see in the economy is lots of distortion of numbers, lots of distortion of metrics. Right? The fact that we have a debate over whether we are in a recession or not is kind of laughable, right? Because we've been in a recession for 24 months. If you were measuring the production of goods and services, all you got to do is look at the variety of things that were available to you in January of 2020 versus the variety of things available to you today and the delays. If you've got 1/10 the selection and it takes 3 times as long to get it and it costs 20% more, I mean, fundamentally, money is an energy system to transfer energy over time and space, right? That's the right way to think of it. Fat is an organic battery. It's your way to transfer organic energy. If you put 20 or 30 pounds of fat on your body, you can live for 90 days, right? And if you don't eat, you die. So fat was developed over the course of millions and 70 million mammalian years, and it's a pretty wonderful invention when you think about it. It's the reason that we didn't go extinct, or the reason you're not dead. The challenge with money is the fiat currencies that are used commonly as money, they're all broken. They all have a big hole in them. And
the big hole is inflation, period, end of story, or is there something else?
The hole is, we could call it inflation, but inflation is such a charged term because most people think inflation is CPI. The defect in fiat currencies is monetary inflation. It's the expansion in the money supply, not just the increase in consumer goods, because the CPI is it's a sub-metric.